Welcome to Beyond Galileo. I am Gary Gress. I am at the University of Oklahoma in the College of Atmospheric and Geographic Sciences. I am an instructor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Sustainability and on the Faculty Advisory Committee at the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art. Beyond Galileo is a program involving a series of podcasts that explores subjects and ideas surrounding the current exhibition at the University of Oklahoma here at Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art, titled Galileo's World, an Artful Observation of the Cosmos. Each podcast will have artful conversations with experts in their fields from the Norman OU campus to find out how their disciplines, including art, science, philosophy, and many more, bridge Galileo's world to our own. Today, our featured guest is Dean Berrien Moore from the College of Atmospheric and Geographic Sciences. Dr. Berrien Moore, who is sitting here with me, is an internationally recognized and published earth scientist. He joined the University of Oklahoma in 2010 and serves as Vice President for Weather and Climate Programs, Dean of the College of Atmospheric and Geographic Sciences, and Director of the National Weather Center. His current service includes the Committee of Earth Studies at the National Research Council, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory Advisory Council, and the Board of Directors of the University of New Hampshire Foundation. We're really glad to have you with us today, Dean Moore. To start off, I'm just intrigued by so many things that when we walked through this exhibit, I think one of the things that really struck me right off the bat was you gravitated toward, we walked around, went back, and reiterated about this thesaurus, this optical thesaurus called Opticae Thesaurus, and it was one of the first publications and books as we walked in to the first main room. And I'd like you to explain your thoughts on this concept where you were inferring and you even directly defined, if you will, what was called ray tracing. And I thought that was pretty fascinating because here I am in our College of Atmospheric and Geographic Sciences. I've heard of that, but I have never really thought about it in the context that you were talking about. So could you reflect on that?
Sure. Well, you see it in the front piece of that 16th century book, which is really quite extraordinary. And the scene is of, you see the sun and the earth and ships in a harbor across from a fortress and a bridge across the harbor. And you have these rays of light individualized so that you can actually see the linear path, if you will, of the ray of light from the sun down to the fortress. And then across the harbor is this ship, and someone on the ship apparently is looking at the fortress. And so you have the ray of light, essentially the reflected light coming from the fortress, which is what the person views. And it's all done as you begin to map out how light moves from one place to another. Now, that's really quite an extraordinary thought. And yet, if you are going to go into the business of designing a telescope, you better have some understanding of how that lens changes the path of light and what you can do with that lens to change the path of light. You actually see that in this treatise, in that four-piece, because right in the very foreground, there's someone looking in a mirror. And there's a ray of light that is essentially the reflection of your face in the mirror. So I thought this was just extraordinary, and to see the work at such an early stage is just remarkable. And this was really looking at the physics of the system. And then as we talked about in that exhibit, you also see the woodblock print of Dürer's. And so this is early Renaissance. And so here is Dürer essentially using all of that knowledge about how we have perspective. Where do we get the three-dimensional perspective, the idea of a vanishing point? I mean, here in Oklahoma, you can sure see it. Just walk out and look down the railroad. And it looks as if the tracks come together. Now, we know, in point of fact, they don't come together. But if you look, that's what it looks like because of the perspective that you generate in that three-dimensional view. And I think what's extraordinary in this exhibit and this idea of artful observations, there's actually something kind of hidden in that title. And that is that the artists were working out the concepts of perspective 100 years before Galileo was working out that same necessity of perspective and rays of light. So he went to school on the artist as opposed to the other way around. Very interesting.
Yeah, maybe elaborate, because that first room is trying to meld or trying to blend this idea of artist, mathematician,
Yes.
and how that relates to some of the future interpretations, discoveries of Galileo. That first room just sort of, if you will, emphasizes that. So the artist in Galileo was first and second, or always there, and the mathematician in Galileo. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think there he actually begins to, if you will, more quantitatively or more geometrically actually work out the actual details. The artist has worked this out because they deal with trying to, that's particularly in the Renaissance, they were trying to, in some sense, reflect or capture or describe artistically in a painting the world they saw around them with a certain grandiose, with a certain elegance. And that brought that three-dimensionality really to the fore. Whereas before the Renaissance, think of the paintings on an Egyptian vase. They're two-dimensional. I mean, they're very two-dimensional. And so you began in the Renaissance to really work out that three-dimensionality. Now we go forward to Galileo, where he's actually working as a mathematician engineer to actually now manipulate and alter the rays of light, to actually change the pathway as a means of creating the telescopic effect. And what I thought was so interesting was that he's really leveraging off of looking at this three-dimensionality. The other thing that we saw was Galileo working out the use of triangles or pyramids to describe surfaces. And that, as a geographer, we had some fun, you being the geographer, me being the mathematician, thinking about, how do we do that today? Or how have we done that for a long time in terms of describing a curved surface called the Earth?
Yes, that's Euclid's Elements of Geometry.
Yes, it's really quite extraordinary. And Galileo was, I think, fascinated by the use of the triangle to describe a surface. And yet around you, longitude and latitude. So for describing the Earth today, we use longitude, latitude, which is describing the surface with rectangles or things that, they're more rectangular at the equator, and they get less rectangular as you go to high latitudes. In fact, the rectangles begin to be more and more like a triangle as you go to the highest of latitudes. And Galileo's already thinking about what if we just use triangulation as a means of describing surfaces? And this is 19th and 20th century mathematics, which is really remarkable. I mean, he's such a modern human being. Extraordinary.
How, as Dean of the College of Atmospheric and Geographic Sciences, I'm sure this is I think, an obvious question, maybe not. How does this relate to your discipline, our college? How does this all relate in your mind?
Whoa, gosh.
Well,
lots of different ways.
We only have 20 or 30 minutes.
Yeah, that's right. I don't think we're gonna get anywhere by saying let's swap out the longitude and latitude and swap in triangulation.
Right.
I mean, that's useful for other things. But one area that, to go back to your original question on ray tracing, one of the things that we use both in geography and environmental science and in meteorology, and that is satellite observations. And many of the observations that we make with satellites involve reflected light, both in the visible and in the areas beyond that small portion of the spectrum that the human eye observes, but there's lots of other wavelengths, but it involves reflected light. And it involves instruments that take that reflected light and break it into wavelengths or break it into pieces using optical elements. And the very first thing you do when people that you're working with design an instrument like that is very sophisticated software that is called ray tracing. And you trace the rays of light and where they end up, because eventually they have to end up at a detector. So that means you take these rays of light and you send them down different pathways so that they get to the right detector, and then you make your measurement about how much light in that wavelength is hitting that detector. And then that tells you things about the constituents of the atmosphere. It tells you the surface of the Earth. It tells you what vegetation you have or what minerals you have and so forth. So if we had not, as a society, worked out the ray tracing and worked out the idea of a telescope, we would be sorely behind of where we are. And so once again, you have the influence of Galileo on the modern world. And that fundamental part of science science and engineering that he was working out is so fundamental.
Any favorite piece or pieces?
Well, I love the Albert I just love what he does.
The wood
The
carving.
wood block print.
Yeah.
And with the Virgin visiting the temple. But I think the other was the large piece almost directly across the way, where you have a very formal presentation of the ray tracing, where you have someone looking at with a telescope and seeing where the rays of light were coming from, and that the three-dimensionality of, say, a human body, that three-dimensionality is being captured by the difference in pathways of those rays of light. So
that was a wall mural, or
Yes.
what exhibit? Yeah.
And that to me is showing there that Galileo, they were really working this out quite scientifically. And then as many scholars have noted, that when Galileo then uses the telescope to look at the moon and sees the shadows, well, now he can back out what the shadows are coming from, because he knows where the sun is. So he knows where the rays of light from the sun. And if there are those shadows that he observes, he doesn't observe the mountains. He's observing initially, he's observing the shadows. But he can now back out what the mountains must be like, because he's observing the shadows and he knows where the sun is. Boy, that's extraordinary. That's just extraordinary.
I know we have a component of Galileo's artifacts and display in our atrium at the Weather Center. And so just curious, it's a powerful thing that the University of Oklahoma, I think, has chosen to host this prestigious collections. What is your take on this and the history of science collections here, and how fortunate, I know how fortunate we are here in Norman?
Well, the history of science collection is simply unbelievable. It is one of the finest in the world. The collection of Galileo is the finest in the world, but you have marvelous other artifacts from Kepler and Newton, and then in the non-physical sciences, Darwin. But what I find really fascinating in the exhibit at the National Weather Center is you have a number of 17th and 18th and 19th century books dealing with meteorological phenomena, so that we actually are seeing early work on meteorology. And in fact, there's one dealing with severe weather and lightning, and apparently this is something that Franklin read, and then I've never known how true the kite and the key is, but at least it gave part of what Franklin's interest in the Earth was. I mean, he was quite an extraordinary Earth scientist as a amateur, you might say. But then you have one of the first works on tornadic conditions. And if you think about a very complicated piece of fluid dynamics, which is what a tornado is, a very complicated piece of fluid dynamics, to begin to see how that was being worked out in the 19th century with limited observations and to really being thought about, that's really quite extraordinary. And so you find at the Weather Center collection not only the works of Galileo and Kepler, but you also find these more modern pieces dealing with meteorological phenomena, including this very first description of a tornado. It shows how rich the human culture is. I went to the basketball game the other night to see the women play Oklahoma State, and in going through the area that has a marvelous set of quotes, there's the great quote about standing on the shoulders. And that is very clear as human society. We really are so dependent upon all the work that has gone before. And this is really captured. And that's also very nice when the modern piece is dealing with the Apollo exploration of the moon.
Yeah, we walked through that, and I know you were looking at a McCall, if I remember correctly, some of those lithographs.
Yeah.
And actually, we both stopped at that one. yeah, I mean, the influence, putting this thing in context. And sometimes we don't do that. And these exhibits, they help us really go back in time, put a whole bunch of things in context.
That's right. And you look at those pieces, and then, of course, though it's not in the exhibit because it's in everyone's mind, the photograph of the Earthrise over the lunar horizon, and talk about what must have been truly this enormous sense of perspective. Really puts ray tracing in a whole new context where there you are above the lunar surface in orbit, and you see the Earth come up, as opposed to what our normal view is, seeing the moon rise. And that is the thing that all of us human beings are very, it's romantic, it's beautiful, it's all of the things that give us spirit to see the big full moon coming up. Now just imagine see a big full Earth coming up in the Earthrise, and the emotions that must have had on the astronauts at the time. And because it is one of the most profound images that I think the human race has ever presented. Truly profound.
It is. Any closing thoughts?
Well, I guess the thing that it reminds us is that, and it's sometimes hard when we're looking at a historical figure. Many times I think when we look historically and we think about George Washington, we don't really think of him actually existing. He's just a historical figure. He exists only on the pages of books or on a dollar bill. And with this exhibit, you have a feeling of Galileo more as a person and the richness of the exhibit. And not only just Galileo, but that all of our forefathers and foremothers and so forth, they really were people. Even though, that sounds like a trite thing to say, but you have to sometimes put yourself in the context of Galileo got up in the morning and went to work and thought about things, and he was a human being, just like you and me.
Well, we thank you.
No,
and
delightful. I'm glad you're doing this.
I'm glad you had a chance to stop by. And again, you've been listening to Beyond Galileo. Hope you listen to many of these podcasts. And again, Dean Moore, thank you so much.
No, thank you, Gary.